everyone, we are Geeks Not Nerds. I'm Captain Logan.
And I'm Dan.
Dan, how are you doing, man?
I'm doing very well. How are you?
I'm good. Today, Dan and I are going to talk about historical accuracy in period pieces, Dan, and how important that is. Now, we've done discussions before about, like, biopics and things like that, where, like, how important is it that you get every detail of the thing right, and, like, are you telling a story versus trying to depict, like, what really happened and that kind of thing. This is a little bit different in that it's about a thing that is fictionalized in the first place, but once again, is it important to get the history right? How accurate must that be? How much of a responsibility do filmmakers, storytellers have in making that accurate, because of presumably a lot of people that will suspect that that's exactly the way it was, because a lot of people, unfortunately, kind of get their history from just movies they watch.
Yeah, which is really sad.
So what do you think, Dan? How important is this? Is it like I always say, where you just need to, tell as good of a story as you can? Is it about communication? What do you think?
No, I think you're largely right. It's about telling a good story, and I think the thing is, like, history is really complicated, obviously, and if you want to learn something about history, 2-3 hour movie isn't the best way to do it, but like.
Even in a biopic or a documentary,
exactly.
Do some reading. Yeah.
Exactly. But if you're a filmmaker and you want to set something in a certain period, it's all about creating the world that you want to live in, right? Like, I've seen filmmakers create an idealized version of a certain time period, like the 1950s, for example, or like what films of that era tended to look like and what film portrayed the society is looking at that, like, at that point. Because obviously, like, what movies look like is vastly different from what actual society at large looks like. So, I mean, yeah, I think it just depends on the specific situation of what you're talking about. But obviously, if you say your movie's set in the 1960s and, you see, there's a mistake in the background where someone's wearing something that looks completely modern and somebody notices it, it's going to take them out if it's obvious, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, it's all about consistency, really, I think.
Yeah, that's excellent. I agree with that. Well, we're not. But for me, it also depends on how stylistic the thing is.
Right.
If you are making a piece, and it's as much for me about communication as it is about consistency in either direction. If it's going to be a very realistic thing, then you want to get that stuff as period accurate as you can. I also think that viewers should be somewhat suspicious in a way of everything, you know what I mean? Where, like, if it's a period you don't know real well, you shouldn't assume that that's exactly the way it was.
Right.
But you make it, you make it consistent with whatever it is you're doing. So, like, if you're doing, like, a really stylized, heightened version of a particular period in a particular place, you can get away with a lot of liberties as long as you're making it really clear that that's what you're doing. That nobody's gonna, for instance, complain that even though a lot of stuff in the, for instance, like 1989 Batman movie looks very 1940s, that there's technology in that movie that wasn't there, because it's a movie at a time. So you just make that kind of thing really clear.
Right, and, you see that all the time with the 1940s. I mean, that's kind of like the culprit of 20th century and 21st century film, really, of just portraying the 1940s in different lights, and they're all worthwhile in their consistency. Like, you see things like, I don't know, Captain America: The First Avenger, where that movie is clearly an idealized version of what the 1940s were like. And then you get something like what Spielberg did with a lot of his projects, like Saving Private Ryan and Schindler's List and Band of Brothers in the Pacific, where it's like portraying or attempting to capture what the 1940s were actually like what it was like being in that war at that time. I mean, the story that he's telling is kind of bombastic in and of itself, but the Saving Private Ryan got a lot of praise when it came out, in that Spielberg wasn't afraid to just show people, like American soldiers, just coming on that beach and just hundreds of them being gunned down like it actually was. Like, people who were at the battle said, yeah, that's actually what happened. It was just people running into machine guns and dying. and that's part of a period piece, I suppose, and he had to portray that because that was the specific situation he was trying to portray. It's all about making it work within the context of your film. Like the 1970s in X-Men Days of Future Past, I felt like was cool because it was an exaggerated version of that. Like there was just funk music in the background all the time. I really enjoyed that aspect of it.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, it largely depends on what you're trying to do, I guess.
Well, I think any way you slice it, it's always going to be an interpretation.
Right. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Exactly.
Especially if you're talking about a time period that is far enough gone that nobody is alive now that experienced it.
Oh yeah.
Like when we talk about period accuracy, I mean, it's accurate to the history as we know it. But you're never gonna get perfect because you weren't there, you didn't experience, and even if you were there, and even if you do have that memory's very faulty, and you always remember things through a lens. You brought up First Avenger. Something I like about that is that you say it's an idealized 1940s, and it does have that. It's not a perfect 1940s. There's bad things that happen there. But I mean, it deals a little bit with sexism and some stuff like that. But it's also, because of the fact that Steve Rogers shows up in the present day at the end, I get the feeling, especially on a second watch, that what I'm watching is almost like his perspective of it looking back on it. Like I know that it's not like him telling the story to anybody or whatever, but with like the lighting filters and stuff like that, it feels idealized from the perspective of a man out of time that misses it. And so
he's looking back on the good old days, sort of thing.
Yeah, and so it kind of gives you that sense of like nostalgia. But like I said, anyway, slice it. You're always gonna it's always gonna be like somebody's interpretation of that history, and a lot of the time we think that we know more than we do.
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, especially farther back you go, the less you're gonna know. I mean, Hollywood's been doing films for a long time about the classic stories of antiquity too, like the story of Julius Caesar or the biblical stories, and those movies always portrayed things of the modern way in which we think about some of those cultures and the way they dress, especially. And it's not really period accurate, but people have associated that image with that period in history so much that they kind of have to, right? Especially, I've noticed with like, I can't think of a example clothing wise off the top of my head, but like the way Jesus is portrayed in most films probably isn't the way he actually looked in real life, right? Like, well, he was a guy that just kind of like, he was a wandering nomad. He wasn't like this clean. I mean, he has long hair in most of those movies, but he looks really well groomed and things like that,
Yeah, sure. Well, and most of the major women in history probably weren't nearly as knockout gorgeous as they are in the movies.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. And also, of course, Jesus just wouldn't have been the ethnicity that he's usually. So yeah. There's obviously a lot of that. You also have the issue a lot where, in order to appeal to the sensibilities of your movie-going audience, and not just movies, we get this in books and really everything. You're dealing a lot of the time with whatever the modern morality is and ideology is, and will kind of transpose that onto the people that lived in a different time. You get like for instance, and I've been hearing this come up a lot more often lately. A lot of people forget that a straight up literal interpretation of the Bible is a very new idea. Only in like the last 100 years or so do people tend to take as much of some ancient texts as literally as we do now. So when you look at things like, or even like our modern thoughts on like homosexuality and things like that, and then we take that and we go back in time, and you look at cultures that had different ideas about that and wouldn't have talked about it as openly and that sort of thing, and we have a tendency to make people talk about things more like they would now. Sometimes it's pandering, and sometimes it's just people not thinking that about how that's different. I don't know if you agree with that, but
no, I think a lot of times you're right. What they'll do is like have one character that sort of is sort of a catch-all for whatever modern sensibility they're trying to insert into the movie that they're talking about. For better or for worse, I mean, I've seen it done in really good ways, like Agent Carter, for example.
Yeah.
She's a character that's dealing with, not being taken seriously because she's a woman in a time where women aren't taken as seriously in the workforce. And she's obviously really competent. It's kind of like talking about the place women have today in our society versus what they were now, and comparing them, which is an interesting exercise, I think. And it's not inconsistent, because obviously there were women that were really good at things back in the 1940s as there were in every time, right? So yeah, I mean, I think that can be worthwhile sometimes, and sometimes it's not. It just depends on how you do it, right?
Well, yeah, and I love that you brought that up, because the distinction for me is the difference between having people act and think about things in a really modern way from in a piece set 200 or 300 years ago versus exposing the things from that the issues from that time period that are still issues that we deal with today, but dealing with them the way that it was then. So you deal with sexism and racism and that kind of thing, and you don't have to change you don't have to go back and change the culture to make it match ours for it to still be relevant to today.
Right, exactly. And I think that can be a worthwhile exercise. And,
absolutely it is. I mean, I just reviewed the 1943 or 40, is it 47? 47. Miracle on 34th Street, and I made a big deal in that review about how looking back on that movie now, and of course that's not a period piece, that's a piece set in the time that it was made, but looking at late 1940s, I was with this movie. I was seeing how things didn't seem to be as different as you might think they would be, and how people were treating each other in business, and looking at people as numbers as opposed to people, and all the kind of modern cynicism that we're always talking about now, and how to combat that. And it's like a lot of the combating modern cynicism things that we're seeing today in movies in 2016 were all the same issues were back then. People just seem slightly more polite about it.
Yeah, one of the things I really like about period pieces and historical fiction in general is because one of the things I like about it so much is that it's a lot like science fiction, in that you just take the issues that the society that you live within currently is going through and put it in a different context, so you're not as close to it, and you can sort of parse it out and figure out what the real issues are. It's the same sort of exercise as just putting them in a different context. Like science fiction is speculative; you're looking into the future, whereas historical fiction is looking in the past. It's almost the same sort of thing, and I think that's why I like both of them so much.
Me too. It's doing it in a mirror, really, where it's one of them is kind of going back to see how things haven't really changed, and the other is going forward and exaggerating things. At least when you're talking about like cautionary tales and something kind of Orwellian. Yeah. Not everything futuristic and speculative is that way. You have Star Trek that's more optimistic than that. Right. Instead of exaggerating it, that's saying here's how we could do things better. But yeah, when you're talking about like the more Orwellian side of it, you're right. It is kind of it is weirdly almost the same kind of thing. Just doing it as an exaggeration.
You can do the same thing, like that an idealized piece about how great the 1940s was. With Star Trek, you look forward and see how great things might be in the future, right? And just putting things in different contexts.
And importantly, how difficult it is to keep it that way.
Exactly.
Because like the way you hold to the human condition, it's exactly the same thing as I talk about this all the time, but it's like Captain America or Batman, where you have these characters trying to stay the same but constantly having their ideals challenged. So like the way that you make a positive future story, this has nothing to do with what we're talking about. The way you make a positive future story really interesting is by having these people seeming to have fixed society, and how difficult it is to keep it that way.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. And that's one of the things I appreciated so much about Man in the High Castle, which came out recently. That was so cool because it was period accurate in that it was as period accurate as it could possibly be with its premise, which was like
alternate
America
history
transformed by two very different cultures split down the middle, which it was just such an interesting thing to see period historical fiction wise, and it made you really feel like you were living in a society that was a hybrid between the two of them. It didn't really merge very well, and I suppose that's kind of a representation of what America's always been. Like we're the melting pot, you know, like tons of different cultures come here and melt and rift against each other, but ultimately we're one kind of, you know, hodgepodge country, sort of like that one was, but they were forcing it. I don't know, that show stuck out to me as the most recent, like, historical, accurate sort of thing that was really well done. I like that show a lot.
And what I love with that is the struggle between Western and Eastern ideals, and the idea that you have, you know, especially when you look at the Japanese side, where you've got, because I took a whole class on, when I was in college, on Japan after 1945, and how when we occupied Japan, we westernized it. And this was exactly the reverse of that, happening after the same conflict, which was just super fascinating. And so you've got the Japanese coming over, trying to Easternize, and really, like, looking down on us, and it almost... We were sort of doing the same thing when we took over Japan, where we kind of looked at them as children that we had to, like, you know, make grow up and fix and stuff. For them, it was more like we're second-class citizens and we're almost like in the Dark Ages or something, and they've got to like they've got to like fix us and make us more civilized. And it was really cool. But what was really interesting about it was, still, being in America, which was so different from any other place, there's still this westernization that was happening to them too, like all at the same time. And I just love that. When you're talking about historical accuracy with that, since this is, to bring it back to the topic, since it's not history that really happened, how do you be historically accurate with a because it's not a... I mean, it's a period piece. It's set in a particular period, but it's historical fiction, and again, it's speculative, but going backwards, saying if, like what if Japan and Germany won the war? What would things be like you know after that? It's sort of like Watchmen. What if Nixon got elected 5 times? And
we won
several times. Yeah, we won Vietnam and all that stuff. I'm sorry, I was quoting a line from that. He didn't win 5 times. He won like 3 times. But anyway, he was voted for several times because Nixon ran before whatever. So, but anyway, but how do you be accurate? Well, you try to extrapolate based on what you know things were like before this happened. So if Germany stuck with their Nazi ideals after they won, what would they turn our country into? Once again, you still would have you still end up with an interpretation. Somebody else could write, I think, the exact same story and have a different interpretation that you and I might still totally buy as being another way it could go.
Yeah, that's true. And when I say historically accurate, too, I was thinking about, just because I love cars so much, like the automobiles in that show, like it all looks authentically 60s, but it's like in a different context, like a different society came up with the car, but they had the same technology at their disposal, right? It was just interesting in that way that they made everything look authentically 60s, but American, Japanese, and German at the same time.
I was really impressed with how fully realized that world was and how believable that universe is, because there was so much thought. I guess now we're reviewing this. There was so much thought, and maybe at some point we should do a whole video on that.
We should, yeah, I'd love to.
I'd love to go back and watch it through again. And that is a weird show in that I feel like I've only seen about, like a small fraction of this much larger story. But it's like House of Cards, where it's like you're going to get to like chapter 63 or something. But anyway, so with Man in the High Castle, you've got such attention to detail with how some technology is stagnated and some isn't, depending on who is in charge and running what. And I thought that was really cool. Like, there is, so like, obviously you've got basically a police state, and the state runs everything, and nobody really has any actual freedom, and there's not much innovation that can happen in the private sector. So music, doesn't hardly change at all from after the war. Like, music in that show is fascinating. Because everything, well, first of all, there's all kinds of things that are banned, which just immediately messes with your culture and stagnates things, right? So a lot of the music that you hear in that show was either stuff that really was written around that period, but felt like things that we could have gotten to, but the rest of it was all stuff that was from back in that in the period from after the war. At the same time, the Nazis have like this super futuristic jet.
Yeah.
Because they're able to keep, as long as it's like a military thing, and like it's the military making it, they're able to keep innovating.
Yeah, it was really cool in that way.
Space age-ish stuff, like, yeah.
Yeah, it was really interesting. I'm not sure that I've seen speculative fiction done that well on screen in a long time. I mean, I can't really think of anything off the top of my head that I've seen done as well recently. Certainly, like, we brought up the X-Men movies earlier, like, they do it well enough, but I just don't think those movies felt authentically what the time period they were in as much as that did. I mean, for Days of Future Past felt a little bit more 70s than First Class did, but...
It's also a really weird thing to compare because they're both sort of heightened stylistic things, but one of them is really comic book and one of them is trying to be more realistic. I suppose. And X-Men's doing it
more grounded for sure.
And X-Men's doing it in more of a tongue-in-cheek, like, kind of clever, fun way. And Man in the High Castle is supposed to be scary.
Right. Yeah.
I mean,
exactly.
they're very different things, and we're constantly pushing the envelope of craziness with X-Men, where the First Class was pretty much just what if the mutants. It's kind of fun. It is speculative. It's a what if question. It's like what if the mutants were responsible for the Cuban Missile Crisis? Then you get into Days of Future Past, and it's what if a mutant was responsible for the but accidentally, it turns out, for the death of JFK. And there's some other things in there. Then we're going to get to Apocalypse, and this dates this video. We're going to get to Apocalypse, and it's going to be, what if a mutant goes all the way back to antiquity and messes with the way people look at God and religion? You know what I mean? So at that point, it becomes the entire history of mankind is speculative fiction. Yeah, it's not even, we get to a point, and because like Star Trek is up to it, we have regular history, and then up to basically, the 60s, things starting to change. Really, the 90s with Khan is when things really get different. But especially because, that was extrapolating from the 60s, so obviously the 90s did not happen that way. We've lived them now, but it's like the Star Trek Encyclopedia, written by the Okudas in the 90s, was called the Star Trek Encyclopedia: The History of the Future, which I always thought was really cool that they call it that. And the idea was supposed to be that it's also kind of it's weird how this video has turned from historical periods to like historical movies to changing history movies. It's kind of funny. But it's basically also a historical, changing kind of story, but with a history that we don't even know how it's going to unfold yet.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting. I'm trying to think of other things I've seen. I mean, the bottom line when it comes to historical accuracy, I think if people are interested in history, they should definitely read some books about it. Just don't get all your history from movies, because you'll be very much deceived.
yeah, and I think that we maybe assume too often that deception is on purpose.
Oh no, yeah, of course. I mean, I don't think that there's a cabal of producers and directors saying how can we deceive the public and make them think the 1950s were this way, or the 1940s were this way. I just think it's a director trying to tell a story, and they said in the 1950s, and the tone of the story informs the world, the kind of world that they live in, even though they have the aesthetic of that time period, and there's certain touchstones. Most people, if they want to tell a story in the 1950s, you're going to have Greases with leather jackets and You're going to have like jukeboxes and stuff like that, like big automobiles. But you could tell a story with the 1950s that's like, a really feel-good movie, or you could tell a story about, a greaser gang that's kind of scary, and the world might look completely different in where it is, what locations you shoot in, and show the world through a different lens in that regard. I mean, the world is a very complicated place. And we're just talking about, this whole video, we've been talking about the history of just the United States and like the various decades of the 20th century. I mean, there's so many other places you could go with this and historical accuracy. I mean, there's a whole entire genre of American movies, the Western, that take place around the Civil War period, and whether or not most of those are historically accurate is is up to debate.
Well, yeah, I mean, I believe in the idea of a creative license to a point where, like,
I agree.
Part of the fun of making a movie like that, much less watching it, is to get to live in that period and the parts of it that you think are really fun and are the reason that you would love to get in a time machine and go back to that time. And so you're gonna naturally, without thinking about it, create this if not idealized version, the version that is putting into deeper focus the parts of it that you're most interested in. And immediately by doing that and not being capable of showing all the facets of it, you're immediately creating a different kind of idea about it, a different feel for people about it than what it would really be. Unless you can go back in time and go walk around and see every. I mean, you think about just the time period you live in now. Nobody knows exactly what things are like for everybody. You know what I mean? To some degree, we are all somewhat isolated with whatever our experiences are.
Yeah, we're all individuals. We all have our separate experiences, and they inform behavior and a variety of things.
I mean, I don't mean to say that we're all detached and none of us is world savvy, or what's the word I'm looking for? We're not aware of what things are like at large. But as you said, the world is complicated. You're always going to be wrong about something. You're not going to be completely knowledgeable.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you look at the variety of kind of movies that westerns are. You have like the typical action movie star hero western movie where he's the good guy riding in with his sidekick. They go and they save the day and they stop train robbers and stuff. And then you look at a movie like Django Unchained, which is a completely different kind of movie set in the same time period. They have varying degrees of historical accuracy, I suppose, but they're aiming at kind of creating the same time and place, but have their very different perspectives on it. It speaks to what you're talking about, which I think is really interesting. I very much would, if I was a movie director, I'd very much want to set most of my movies in the past, because I think it's interesting to explore things like that. I mean, the future's interesting to me too, but I love history so much that I don't know. I'm not one of those people that thinks everything needs to be now for the kids. Like, that seems to be an attitude with a lot of movies that that are being made contemporarily. I really appreciate that one of the big blockbuster franchises, the X-Men, they're not afraid to do period pieces, because I think it's a cool experiment. Making everything modern is not always my favorite thing to do. That's why I thought it would be cool to talk about something like this.
Yeah. And once again, it's important to remember that when you set a piece in the past, the human condition remains the same.
Yeah, exactly.
That, like, people are still people. Whatever, whether even you believe in the notion of the human condition or not, just that people are always people, and so you're always going to be able to relate to, something will resonate if you make something character driven and about people, no matter what time period it's set, and you'll find human truths. Dan, I'm always leery about writing period pieces because I'm always afraid of getting the voice wrong. Like the way people speak in a particular, a lot of research. Yeah,
like that. I've heard the amount of research that writers do for writing in periods like that, and it's just tons and tons of research. Even the specific, like, a time in, place in time that they want to write a story in. Like if you wanted to write a story in, I don't know, 1920s Connecticut or something like that. Like they have to research have an example town that's similar to the town they want to set it in, and like how business was conducted there. Like you have to do a lot of research in just like the world it's set in, and then getting the people's voice right would be even.
Well, it's hard
to do a lot of reading from that time period, like how people. Articulated themselves, and even then, like people's writing voice is very different from the way they speak and the cadence they have in writing dialogue too. I mean, imagine that's very difficult.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard enough to write about a place you've never visited. Mm-hmm. Imagine writing a place you haven't visited of a time period you didn't live in. Like I'm not that old. I don't know that I wouldn't make a lot of mistakes if I even went back and did a period piece set in the late 80s, set in the early to mid 90s even at this point, which feels really weird to me because, obviously I was a 90s kid and it doesn't feel that long ago. But how easy is it to forget that some of the modern conveniences we have even now are different than they were then? And I don't mean things as easy as I wouldn't give somebody in 1995 a smartphone, but there are subtle things that you would kind of forget. You'd forget that the lingo was different. There are certain things that people would be likely to say, and of course. You also want to be really careful that you don't overdo the lingo, where you're like, look at me, I know how people talked back then. Where you really over exaggerate that. But then it would also be really easy to accidentally have somebody say something that I know this isn't even as big of a thing as it used to be, but nobody in 1998 is going to say YOLO. That's you know what I mean,
Right, exactly, and that's one of the biggest slip ups I see in historical period films is. Dialogue stuff. A lot of the time they're just using words and phrases that weren't used by people back then, and sometimes in period pieces, and obviously when you're doing a piece set in the past in a different culture, like it's kind of a given that you're going to take some sort of license if it's a Hollywood film, because they're going to make it in English, even if it's like a film about ancient Rome. Everyone's going to be speaking English. No one's going to be speaking Latin because nobody wants to watch an entire movie with subtitles. I know some people would, but that's not something that you do if you want to make a mass market.
It's not going to be a real accessible film. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. So there's kind of a given there, and the farther back you go, I suppose you might be able to play with it a little more. You just got to make them sound generally sort of regal. They have to be sort of proper.
Low Shakespearean.
You see it all the time.
Yeah.
What were you going to say, sorry?
I just a lot of the time we just try to make it sound kind of heightened and Shakespearean.
Yeah, exactly. I was going to say, that's exactly what I was going to say. Just sound fancy British.
Thor is Viking, and we do Shakespearean talk with that.
That's true.
Yeah.
And those people probably did not speak at all like Shakespeareans.
No, but you're right. If it sounds vaguely regal, then it seems like it has that air of opulence and also that air of just being old. Being old-fashioned, being set way in the past. It makes us think of antiquity.
Yeah, exactly, and I think the problem becomes more obvious as you move forward, because I don't know, people aren't used to seeing like the 1950s or the 1960s or 70s being portrayed like that. Like if someone goes back and does something like subtle in like the 1970s, we're like, oh, what's up, something like that. Like nobody's gonna say something like that. And I've heard you talk about the things. I can't think of an example off the top of my head, but you're like, oh, I can't picture someone saying that back then. Like that just doesn't sound correct, or someone, it just takes you out because if everything else is authentic. That's fine, but the people are the most important thing in the story, at least, to me.
Yeah, I mean, if the story's great, that might not necessarily totally kill it, but a lot of the time...
It's like the worst offense, I think, of slipping up in your accuracy if you're trying to create an atmosphere like that.
Yeah, importantly, a lot of the time a mistake like that is a symptom of a larger problem. Like I'll bring up sometimes when we're reviewing things or just having a discussion, things like that, and people will think that I'm nitpicking, but a lot of the time what I'm talking about is a symptom of a larger problem, which is simply a matter of not being thoughtful, of being careless in putting the thing together. You go, I want to set it in this period because it's a neat period, but I didn't really do my research, and especially if it's a period that just wasn't that long ago, it seems kind of worse because there are people in the audience that were there. and they just know that that wasn't part of the vernacular at the time.
Right. Yeah.
And so I don't know. Like you said, you're gonna have to take some liberties all the time when you're talking about like setting something in ancient Rome or whatever. You're gonna you still got to communicate a story to the audience. So you know where I think you earn a lot of brownie points is when you make the culture at large, the background, as real to life as we understand it. Now, I also think that it can be a big problem when you have characters constantly, like in forced exposition, just like throwing out factoids. Mm-hmm. Like we've seen this a lot, right? Where someone will you this has nothing to do with history, but you described, and I'm going to bring this up all the time because it cracks me the heck up. You described the Ninja Turtles movie from 2014 as as basically just an adaptation of the Wikipedia page, and. Yeah. Sometimes I feel like a historical piece will be just an adaptation of the Wikipedia page, where people are just throwing out factoids about that time period, and you're like, no, the people that live there would not be telling each other about these obvious things that are going on. You just make those background.
Yeah, exactly. I'm trying to think. You know, especially when you have a society that's very different, I think there's a lot of different ways to do it. This is the example I was thinking of. I lost it for a second there.
Yeah, sure.
This isn't a historically accurate movie at all. 300. I like that a lot of movies set in the past as an adaptation of the Greco-Persian Wars, and it's not really historically accurate at all.
It doesn't have to be, though. I don't think anybody watching that movie thinks that it is, or at least I hope they don't.
I was going to make a point as to
go ahead.
What the culture at the point was at the time.
Yeah.
I think the way that the Persians look in that movie is supposed to be a representation of how foreign they look to the Greeks, like there's giants and stuff, and like. And they're riding on elephants, and they look like, you know, demonic beings and things like that. I think back then, when you were so isolated in your culture, where like you didn't have a lot of communication with other people from other lands, they would look that strange and foreign to you. Like in the stories, they might have exaggerated that, thinking, oh, you know, through the eyes of these people that have never seen anything other than a Greek person in robes, you know, these people do look that strange to them. So I think that's an interesting visual way to do it. Like say something about the historical period without being accurate at the same time.
Well, that's a great point. 300 is neat in its POV and perspective. Because it's not just a matter of they might have looked at strange to people, but also remember that movie that story is being told from a storyteller who is exaggerating stuff, and you know that he's exaggerating. So the pre-sequel, I guess that's what we call those now. We have a movie that's set both in the past and the future. Also did that, and so like the first time I saw it, I was like, oh, okay, so this is like a again an alternate history piece that is got supernatural components, but it turns out that it doesn't have supernatural components. That's just the way that the storyteller is spinning it, and how people are more readily able to understand what's going on, because, and also not just what's going on, but also they're taking their mythology and making it real to them. And so like they're when you have like a god king, you deify someone, and then you create this supernatural component that wouldn't have actually really been there.
Right. Yeah. I still haven't seen that. I'm gonna have to get around to seeing it at some point. So did they deviate from Greek history, or was it based on events and they embellished them like they did with the first one?
I mean, they definitely were embellished, and I think it was based somewhat on things that actually happened. I forget. It's not real memorable. It's not great. Okay. I found the violence in that movie to be more gratuitous than it had to be over the first one. Where I understood why it was that way in the first one, and the second one it seemed like they were almost like killing time, lobbing heads off in slow motion. It was kind of the feel I got from that. Anyway,
100 minutes, we'll kill all of them.
Well, at least it wasn't 300 minutes. Dan, final thoughts on this?
Like you say jokingly, whenever you get into one of these discussions, it depends.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
But yeah, I mean, obviously, I like history a lot, so whenever I see one of these historical adaptations, I look for historical accuracy, but it's not always a deal breaker. You know, the 300 example I just mentioned, it works really well. So I think it just matters, how you tell your story, and just be well researched. That's the main thing. Like, if I can tell someone's done the research on the period and they really made an attempt to understand the period they're setting it in, and there's a reason for it being set in that period, and they're trying to say something about it, then that's when I appreciate it much more. Like, things that are arbitrarily set in time periods and they might as well have been set in modern day, that's where it kind of starts to bother me.
That's really interesting because it's one of what I always tout up as a basic tenet of writing, which is if you're gonna break the rules, know what they are.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's exactly the same thing as setting a thing like that. The final thing I want to mention is, or end off with, is just returning back to that question from the beginning of this discussion, of how much of a responsibility do filmmakers have for making sure that that they either are presenting history as much of the way that it was, even through an interpretation. I mean, that's really sticky, of course. But as they can to people, or making it clear that it isn't that way. I think there's a little bit of a responsibility. I think that you shouldn't be misleading on purpose. You know what I mean? You shouldn't make a movie and pretend like this is the way it was because you have some sort of social agenda. That's always bad. I mean, preachy movies are a problem anyway. I mean, morality plays can be cool, but you know what I mean, where you have a movie that's basically...
We don't want to have, Soviet propaganda films being made where Joseph Stalin is present at events that he wasn't in reality during the revolutions and things like that.
Yeah, you don't want...
With regard to history, that'd be ridiculous.
Yeah, you don't want movies that are made to try to make people think the history is the way that a group of people want it to be, because they're trying to rewrite it through movies, and I think I think that can happen. And it has happened throughout. Since film's been invented, it's been used to do things like that. Yeah, sure. I mean, you don't want a movie, and especially in countries where the basically the state gets to decide what goes in a movie and who's allowed to make them, and
kind of stuff.
Yeah. And I mean, I don't know if that still happens anywhere in the world now. It may. But
I'm sure it does. Countries with state-owned media companies, I'm sure it still happens.
But for instance, you wouldn't want somebody to make a movie that was trying to make everybody think that Abraham Lincoln only went to war to free the slaves.
Mm-hmm.
That's just right. You don't want a movie that's saying all the stupid stuff that we heard in elementary school that wasn't really true. You know what I mean? You don't want somebody to make a movie solely to say no. What happened with the Americans and taking over the Native Americans, it was okay. That was we didn't do anything to the Native Americans. Don't make that movie.
Conflicts are always tough because it's you can't possibly portray the reasons that a war happens in a 3-hour movie. A lot of people are naive and think wars happen for singular reasons, and that's never the case. There's always war happens for a multitude of very complex reasons. There's always multiple factors to why those conflicts start. So it's very tough watching movies that deal with why war happens and the consequences of it. You got to be very careful.
That's why it's better to make movies that are about individuals. Right. Than it is to try to make a great... epics are cool, but even a lot of our greatest epics center around a central protagonist. And, Dan, the way
look at the Odyssey, going all the way back to Homer, right. Epics like that. They portrayed real events, but embellished them a lot, and they focused on one character and their journey,
Yeah, I mean, the way I learn history best, Dan, is through the lens of a person. You know, where as opposed to like just getting the like dry facts, a person that was involved doing things that I become invested in, and then I remember the stuff that happened, you know, at large. So
if you were to take up a historical profession, you'd much rather be a biographer than a historian.
Absolutely,
because you like to study the lives of individuals rather than, you know, the big picture.
Yeah, and it just more that would stick with me.
Yeah, exactly.
You know,
and I have that to some degree too. I mean, I think the individual stories of people are fascinating, but I also like looking at the big picture too, and learn a lot of those dry facts.
Sure. Absolutely, it's just they stick with me better if I start from the lens of here's and that's why I think that in a 2-3 hour movie, like you're talking about, you can make those nuances and complexities come alive a lot more and seem a great deal more real, and actually explore them through people as opposed to you know, trying to make it this big grand you know, almost like third person omniscient thing.
Definitely.
But yeah. Anyway, well, Dan, we are all out of time.
It was a good discussion, though.
Yeah, I think so. Well, what do you folks think about historical perspective? That's important. About the responsibility that filmmakers have to make things as historically accurate as possible, and whether or not that's even a thing that you can really accomplish. Dan, thanks so much for joining me on Geeks Not Nerds.
No problem at all. I had a great time, and I hope you guys enjoyed watching it.
Yeah, folks, you're going to see Dan a lot more often here on Geeks Not Nerds, as Vince has become far too busy with his job and things to be here regularly now. So unfortunately, Vince isn't going to be with us regularly. We'll still see him every now and again, but he's kind of taking his leave from the channel, and we're going to miss him, and it's really sad. Dan, I know Vince cannot be replaced, but you're gonna I'm sure do a wonderful job standing in for him.
I mean, I wouldn't presume to replace Vince. I mean, he's the man. So no, but I'm just glad you asked me, and I really appreciate being here. And I hope I can fill Vince's shoes at least a little bit. He's a much bigger man than me, though.
He's a little more of a boisterous man than you too, I think.
Yeah, that's true.
Dan, thanks for doing it. I sure appreciate it, and I hope people will enjoy this direction moving forward. If there's something you'd like to hear me and Dan discuss on a future episode of Geeks Not Nerds, feel free to leave that in the comments. And in the meantime, I'm Captain Logan.
And I'm Dan.
Dan, I have to mention this because we did not talk about this ahead of time, but I have to mention that you do have a job at the end of the show.
What is my job?
And your job at the end of the show is reminding you to support your local comic book store.
Okay, so I have been Dan, and I am reminding you to support your local comic book store.
That's pretty good, Dan. Yeah, I think you're hired, buddy.
Thanks.
Thanks. We'll see you later, folks.